Welcome everyone to this last lab, which we are going to do on the first part a bit of Python and kinematics, and then on the second part, it's going to be about checking robots datasheets. Anyway, let's start with the last Python tutorial of DPAM. So last week or in the previous 2 weeks, we discussed how to work with in Python, how to work with variables, imports, comments, while loops, strings, Boolean values, Boolean operations, lists, if conditions, and loops. And today we are going to work on one of the most important features or functionalities in programming languages, which is about doing functions. So the first question for those of you who have never programmed before is, what is a function? And even though perhaps you have never programmed before, you have been using functions since high school. In maths, probably a lot of you met things such as fx equals x squared or fx equals x plus 3. And this is basically a function in maths, which, as you will see, it's very similar to a function in programming. So basically, if you have something like fx equals x squared, you have the function name, which is the f, which, it can be anything. It can be f, it can be g, it can be anything. And then you have the input, which in this case is x. And as I say here, it can be x, it can be y, it can be a, it can be anything. And then you have the actual operation that the function is encapsulating. In this case, it's x squared. But it can be like x plus 2 or the square root of x. It can be anything that you can write in maths. And finally, you have the output, which is what this calculation is going to return. And then the idea is that you can substitute x by any number, and then you are going to obtain the result. So for example, as I say here, if let's say x is 4, it means that every instance of x in the right hand side of the formula is going to be replaced by 4. And then this means that, for example, it's going to be 4 squared, which is going to be 16. So basically, the idea of functions in maths is about finding a way of having something like some big formula that you can encapsulate into like something simpler, like just like the letter f. In programming, is actually very simple, very similar. The main difference is that while in math you only do like math things, in programming, a function can encapsulate any kind of functionality. Like you can put like while loops, if conditions, for loops. It can have anything that you can do with a programming language. So the main idea in programming when using functions is to encapsulate code. That is the idea that you have like several lines of code, like maybe like 20, 30 or 50 lines of code, and you want to encapsulate it into a single line. So then later on, when you want to reuse this code, when you want to reduce this calculation, you don't need to copy the 50 lines, but you can only just invoke this single line, in the same way as before. You use fx, which is going to be translated by the whole math formula. So as I copied here from this website, which is quite good, a function in programming is simply a chunk of code that you are going to use over and over again rather than rewriting it multiple times. And it enables programmers to break down or decompose a problem into smaller chunks, because you can, decompose it into functions, and each function is going to do a particular task that you can reuse. For example, last week when you were writing code in Python, you used the function print. For example, you wrote something like print hello world, and we only need to print this, and then it's going to print on the display hello world. But actually behind the scenes, a lot of things are going on. So the Python needs to read the input from the user, which is going to be hello world. It needs to do some kind of stuff with this, store it in memory, and then it needs to communicate with the operative system, with the screen, in order to display this to you. But as a user, the only thing we need to do is print. We don't need to care about how everything else is implemented. And that's more or less the idea of functions, to put some complex code into a function, and then someone else can use it very easily. So the next thing that we're going to discuss is functions parameters. So when we discuss functions in maths, we said that it transforms inputs into outputs. For example, if we have fx equals x plus 3, x is an input, and then, we are going to have a number like 6, which is going to be replaced here, and then the output of this is going to be 6 plus 3, which is going to be 9. In programming languages, the inputs are often called parameters or arguments. You will see that they use, they use either one or the other, parameters or argument. A function can have one or more parameters or can have zero, for example, as you will see later. So for example, when you invoke the print function in Python, you need to first type the name, and then you need to type parentheses, opening and closing. And then between these parentheses, you are going to put the parameters of this function, which in this case is going to be the string hello world. In this case, it only has one parameter, which is this string, but you can actually invoke print without anything, I think, and it's not going to print anything. So the next most important thing is actually to learn how we can create our own functions in Python. And the most important thing here is that in Python, when we want to create a function, we need to use the keyword def as in definition. So the first thing that we need to do is that we need to write def keyword to tell Python that we are going to define a function. So this is the first thing that we're going to type, use def. The next thing is that we need to write the function's name. This can be anything. Here it says my function, but it can be anything like move robot, jump robot, or I don't know, weather prediction. It can be anything. It doesn't matter. The next thing that we need to do is that we need to write the input placeholders, the parameters or arguments between parentheses. In this case, there are none. So if there are none, we need to put the parentheses opening and closing. If there were, several of them, we need to put, as we will see later on, the different names of the different parameters separated by comma. And then we finish this line with a colon. So, this is the four minimal things that you need in order to make a function in Python is def, followed by the name, followed by parentheses, and followed by the colon. If you miss one of these, Python probably is going to complain and it's going to throw some error. And then we actually need to write like the code that is going to be executed, which is going to be a block of Python code. And something very important is that you can see that the code is indented. Oh, I always get stuck there. By one tab space. So after the colon, the next lines and the next block of lines, all of them need to be tapped by once. If they go back, like, if the next line, for example, was at the same level as the def, it means that it will be considered as outside of the function code and it's not going to be executed when we invoke this function. So just now a bit into detail about the arguments or parameters. And as this website says, which is quite good, information can be passed into functions as arguments. Arguments are specified after the function name inside the parentheses. You can add as many arguments as you want, just separate them by comma. So for example, here I have created a function, def, which has as name my function, and it has only one parameter, which here is name, and then colon at the end. And then this function is only going to execute one line, which is print, hello name. Remember that when we're speaking with strings, like the plus is going to concatenate one with the other. So if name is going to be a string like John, as you can see here, it's going to be hello space John. So this is actually the same function as in the previous slide. Here, the only thing is that I have added one parameter name, which I'm using later on to print the name. And then once I've declared this function, in order to call it, basically we need to use the function name followed by parentheses and parameters if needed. So if I do something like my, underscore function John, this code is going to be executed and it's going to print, hello and the name of the person, like the name of the parameter. If for example, I create a function like this that requires a parameter and I'm not sending any of them. So for example, I just invoke my function opening and closing parentheses. Python is going to complain and it's going to say that it's missing one required argument, which is going to be name. This means that it expects one and exactly one argument. If I give 0 or if I give more, it's going to complain. And this is an example of using two arguments. So for example, here I have def, my function, and it has two arguments, greet and name. And then inside the code, inside the function is going to print greet, blank space, name. So for example, if I invoke something like this function with hi John, it's going to print hi John. But if I invoke this function with something like hello Holly, it's going to do, hello Holly. So you can see that I can put as many parameters as I want. Here it has 2, for example. Here there were 0, here there are 2. So, this is something that is going to depend on the kind of code that you want to execute. Something quite important is that here I'm requiring do 2, so it must be 2. If I, for example, send like 0, 1, or 3, it's going to give the same. It's going to return the same error as before. So the last thing we need to do to understand functions in Python is the return statement. So the thing is that functions, beyond doing things like print or manipulating data, sometimes we want functions to return values, like the ones we were doing before in maths. So in order to do so, we are going to use the return keyword or statement. So for example, if I have a function, which is def, remember, we are defining a function. The name of this function is sum 5 to x, and then it's going to only have one argument, which is going to be x. So for example, if then the body of this function, it can have many other lines, but if one of these lines is return 5 plus x, what it's going to do is that it's going to take the argument, which is going to be 6, it's going to be substituted here, it's going to add 5, and then it's going to, it's going to return this value, and I can store what the function returns into a variable. Something to have in mind is that the return keyword, so once you have the keyword, it's going to finish the execution of the function. So for example, if I had here something else, like, if I had the line return 5 plus x, and then I had a line which was something like print hello world or something like that, that line is never going to be executed. The execution is going to finish at this point. Just remember this if you are using, if you are debugging your code or something, after return, nothing is going to be executed. Return can also return more than one value, many of them in what Python calls a tuple. So for example, if I say return x minus std comma x plus std, and then I invoke this function, it's going to return both of them. I can also return a Python list. For example, I can say a return, square brackets, x minus std, x plus std, x plus 3, square brackets, and then once I invoke this function, it's going to return this list with 3 values. I could have here an extra comma, for example, and have another list, or I can have list within list or anything like this. So the possibilities are actually endless. You can do, many different combinations. You can, just return one value, one list, several lists. This is going to depend on the problem that you are trying to solve.